I've been asked to talk about the Pre Raphaelites, who are a Victorian British art movement. Now, if you're just thinking, right, I'll stop watching this video now and I'll navigate away, just hold on for a moment, because they are particularly interesting. They have been much misunderstood. They have been maligned by the art establishment and treated with derision at times. And I discovered them when I was a young artist in this library book. And I want to share with you how exciting that was and the effect that it had upon me as an artist, particularly in learning technique and aspiring to more and more, rather than being content with whatever level I was already at. So 1848 is the key year. Some young artists and writers founded a brotherhood, united in their determination to elevate art from the dullness they believed it had fallen into to a form of expression of emotional engagement. They started with a hope of reforming the dominant academic way of the day and ended up with an art revolution which was wide-ranging. Pre-Raphaelites is not a stylistic term, it's an indicator of intent. Sometimes people think that there's not much congruity between their works. You see, it's not as simple as people think it is, so keep watching, because I'm really quite passionate about these, which is why I have agreed to make them the very first that I talk about in the series of art history videos. Between 1848 and 1853, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were united, while consisting of members whose natural way of working was very different. The founding members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were from the Royal Academy schools, and they were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, James Collinson, Frederick George Stevens, Thomas Woolner, and William Michael Rossetti, who acted as secretary and historian. He was the only one who wasn't actually an artist or a writer. They met at John Everett Millais' house in London and looked through a book of engravings by Carlo Lasinio of Italian frescoes from the 14th century. And they decided that they could inspire a reformation of English art. I mean, it really is very bold, isn't it, to assume that. And I have to say that as a 14-year-old, I didn't quite realise that that was where they were coming from. I was just looking at pictures like this by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And of course, for a 14-year-old young person looking at paintings that have been very well painted of other young women is quite interesting and quite inspiring. Though never members, Ford Maddox Brown, tutor of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Arthur Hughes and Charles Elson Collins were associated members. The Brotherhood numbered 7 because they were modelling themselves on the Nazarenes, a group of German Catholic artists focused on early Christianity. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood also styled themselves as less mannerist. Abbreviated to PRB, they used images which cut through accumulated layers of cultural association to look sincerely at meaning beneath the surface of their works. And really this one is quite a good example of that, because we have a religious scene which is using ordinary people as the models. And this was considered quite scandalous at the time. There is an irony that the Lasinio engravings are to remove from the original 14th century frescoes were the catalyst for the PRB principle, and I quote, "Absolute and uncompromising truth in all that it does, obtained by working everything down to the most minute detail from nature and from nature only." Now, as a young person living in the countryside, that was particularly inspiring to me, that they would examine nature very closely in their artwork. So I'm just going to turn to one where that happens. So here's an example by William Holman Hunt, where we've got birds in a dovecot. It's called the Festival of St Swithin. You know, it's the legend that if it rains on St Swithin's Day in July, it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. But it's the way those birds are depicted. the way that they have clearly looked at real birds and attempted to make them look as realistic as possible in their painting. That was the sort of thing which was particularly inspiring me at that age. But there was a sort of duality, because the PRB found this out in the prints, and they found formal qualities of incisive outline and sharp, controlled contours were the thing which attracted them. But in fact, what we've got here in the birds is the form turning to make it look three-dimensional, to make it look believable that this could be a real scene within the picture. Anyway, they contrasted these with the pervading influence of Sir Joshua Reynolds on British art. And as you may know, he was the president of the Royal Academy, and his admiration for the high Renaissance painting had encouraged British artists to use loose open brushwork, the stuff that I abhorred at that age, a love of Italianate landscape. I had not yet been to Italy, but I did like the scenes. Pyramid composition, found that fascinating. Gesture and dramatic chiaroscuro. They didn't really mean a lot to me at that age. And I think this is one of the reasons why, for a lot of people, the Pre-Raphaelites are quite accessible. The academics were mostly an emulation without engagement with the mental processes that had brought about the paintings which they admired. But on the other hand, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood had two prominent themes: a romantic medievalism and a concentration on natural detail. Now, I've shown you something of the natural detail, but I'd like to show you something of the interest in medievalism. And I'm just going to turn to a page here where we see the stuff which I didn't really understand at the time. I mean, this is Lorenzo and Isabella. I didn't have a classical education. It didn't mean a lot to me. And I certainly never saw the painting for a very long time, because it's in the Liverpool Walker Art Gallery, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where I lived. But paintings like this were enough to pique my interest in John Everett Millais, because of the composition, so the way things are positioned, and the execution of the human figure. I was learning to draw and paint humans at this time, so I had a particular interest. And the way that there was a narrative in there, there was clearly some sort of story going on, even though I didn't actually know the story in the normal sense. I only knew the story through looking at the painting. So they were a bit of an eye-opener for me in a positive kind of way, in an inspiring kind of way. The Pre-Raphaelites aimed to be humble before nature, faithful to it and reverent of it, in a way that had not recently been seen in academic painting. So I'm going to show you another one which involves nature. So here's one, again by John Everett Millais, of autumn leaves. Now, I was familiar with people burning leaves and things, bonfires and that sort of thing, living in the country. And I recognised that he'd got the light right. This suggested to me somebody who'd spent a lot of time actually studying the subject outside, actually being there and experiencing it, not just making it up inside an art studio. And that was something which I much admired and aspired to do myself. It was a conscious effort to draw close to forms which, in an objective rendering of the natural world, had carried a genuine metaphysical reality. But the thing was, the Pre-Raphaelites didn't completely succeed. Not that I actually understood that as a teenager. But later on, I began to realise that some of the art establishment didn't particularly like them. And as I became a bit more aware of things through study at university, I began to realise that they didn't have it quite right. It was a bit of a sanitised view of medieval life. And it's more in recent years that I've come to understand that the Pre-Raphaelites didn't really understand how people in medieval times regarded everything as divine. I've had the fortune to be able to travel to places in France and places in the UK, places in Italy, and I have a bit more of an understanding that at that time, medieval people regarded everything as divine, everything having come from God, every plant, every bird, every rock, and the architecture of their churches. But the Victorians, a bit like me, a 20th century young person living in a working class environment with a library book as my window into the Pre-Raphaelites, were also at a remove. They were living in Protestant Victorian England, and unfortunately their understanding of history was incomplete. Some of their work relied upon photographs to painstakingly paint the details of an event which would have taken seconds in reality. But their desire for sincerity, realism and truth was also a reaction to the industrialisation and the grey landscapes. So you will notice that in their work there is a purity of colour, and this was something which I found really quite admirable. So looking again at Lorenzo and Isabella, and looking below at another one by John Everett Millais, which is Christ in the house of his parents, which caused absolute outrage when it was painted. I mean, you wouldn't believe that now. Absolute outrage, because he had used ordinary people doing manual work as his models. He had not sanitized the story. He had not made it into some otherworldly type of story. He'd brought it into the reality of the people there before him. And people were genuinely offended. Charles Dickens didn't much care for his depictions of Holy Family and religious subject. So, it reached kind of all levels of Victorian society. The academic painting had perpetuated a sombre dark canvases in the belief that this was how paintings, which they called old masters, looked. And the reality was that these old canvases were discoloured by dirt. And I remember going to see some supposed old masters because I was trying to find out about art. I was trying to learn a bit more. And I would find them incredibly dull, and it was quite difficult to actually see what was going on in them because the predominant colour was brown. But look at the clarity of this by William Holman Hunt. You might at first glance believe that this was a watercolour, but in fact it's an oil painting. And what they did was they adopted fresco techniques. So whereas with a fresco you paint on a white wall and then the light bounces around through the paint pigments and makes the whole thing illuminated, they laid a light coloured ground on their canvases before applying colour to the surface. And you can see here that it produces a feeling of luminescence. And this was the thing that I was attracted to. Plus things like living in the environment I lived in, I regularly saw sheep. So I knew that these sheep were really, really well painted. And so that artist was worthy of my admiration. They achieved a startling vibrancy in their works. I'm going to show you something else which had quite a big impact on me at that age. Turn to the right one, because I'm going backwards and forwards. I mean, sorry, but even now I'm quite excited by it. So this painting here first came into my life on a regular basis because it was the front cover of a set text for an exam which I was studying. And it's called The Blind Girl by John Everett Millais. And I hadn't a hope of seeing it in real life because it was in the Birmingham City Art Gallery, which was a long way away from where I lived, and I'd never been to Birmingham. But I looked at this painting on a regular basis and I enjoyed the clarity of it, the rainbows. I was used to seeing rainbows. The fields, I was used to seeing fields. The detail of the vegetation, the kind of thing that often I had my hands and my face in, closely examining on a regular basis in childhood. But there was also the mystery of this, about the blind girl, and it asks more questions than it answers. And I was fascinated by a painting that would do that was not just merely illustrative, which was engaging your mind and engaging your emotions. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood used literary themes, but sometimes their artwork tended towards illustration rather than artistic statement. And one which has very divided opinions about it is this one here called Ophelia. Now, I first saw Ophelia in this book, and then I was really fortunate because I went on a school visit to London and I was able to go to the Tate gallery and I saw Ophelia in real life, and it really affected me. I probably need to do a whole video just about Ophelia, but didn't know much about the subject matter. Wasn't very learned about Shakespeare. I'd read maybe 3 plays by Shakespeare and not this one. But the thing which particularly interested me was the depiction of the flowers and the way they were floating, and the depictions of nature. Look at the robin there. I've seen robins in environments like that. And I just thought this was absolutely amazing that this artist could actually achieve that level of atmosphere and reality in a painting which was on the wall. And so I wanted to paint like this, and that was a bit controversial. One of the difficulties the first Pre-Raphaelites found was in maintaining meaningful aesthetic tension between the integrity of detail and genuine human experience. The generation of painters working from 1860s to the 1880s admired the style of the earlier Pre-Raphaelites, emulated it and brought it to the detachment of moral aesthetics in their works. And later on, you found that a lot of the artwork was quite decorative. And it's the decorative artwork which I found less interesting. So I'm just going to try and find one very quickly, which I believe falls into the decorative category. Yeah, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Beata Beatrix. Again, you need to know stuff about classical literature, and I didn't. But looking at the picture, I didn't find this particularly interesting. This was not the way I wanted to depict a human form. And even now as an adult, when I know a little bit more about Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he's not one of my favourites. It's to do with technique. So you can see that it wasn't to do with the philosophy behind the Pre-Raphaelites, but it was to do with their techniques and the way they were depicting light. That was the thing which interested me as a young person, but I didn't yet have the language to articulate that. Pre-Raphaelitism developed an impasse. It was important in its influence of the later arts and crafts movement, and often people will attach William Morris to this, although he knew them, he socialised with them. I wouldn't actually classify him as a Pre-Raphaelite, partly because there was the restriction which I've spoken about earlier, where they wanted to be a group of 7. But really he had his own movement, which was the arts and crafts movement. And that was very close to where I lived. And I was unwittingly very much surrounded by that too. I hope you have enjoyed this. I'm aiming to do something a little bit different. I'm aiming not to actually produce some kind of high academic art history video. I don't think there is any need for me to do that. I think those are around. Nor do I need to provide the type of video which is needed perhaps for schools to use. I think there are plenty of those around which, you know, go over things very slowly and with lots of arrows and things pointed to them and lots of lists. I don't want to be providing lectures. Instead, I want to provide something which is passionate and makes you think, may make you go and visit some of the paintings if there are any near where you live, or perhaps chase down a book like this. I'll put a link to the book actually in the description with the video, and I will also make a mention of some of the places in the UK which have Pre-Raphaelite art. It does tend to be centred in the middle of the country, and I might do another video explaining some of why that is. Let me know. I've chosen this as the first one on art history for this series simply because I was asked and because I thought, why not? It's something that I can talk about with quite some interest and passion. I don't normally remember to say this. Sometimes when I watch my videos back to check them, I realise that I haven't said things like hit the bell for notifications and like and subscribe. But if you want to do that and you want to be a bit more engaged, please do. If you want to leave a comment, I do actually read them all myself and I respond to some of them. And I certainly think about what has been written and it informs me in producing other videos. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and I hope you've enjoyed a little dip into the Pre-Raphaelites and the joy that they brought me.